a sick patient is the only thing that makes money, not a healthy one, not a dead one. So we're living life in a not optimal state, and we're kind of just miserable, you know? The food entire system of America is totally getting you sick. And then the pharmaceutical industry is not the answer. It's you actually taking control of your health and changing your lifestyle factors, because these pills just will not save you.
Welcome to Metabolic Matters Podcast. Let's meet today's guest.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another amazing conversation on Metabolic Matters. Our guest today, this young woman blows my ever-loving mind. I am so excited. I'm trying to think, Grace, the first time I knew about you or heard about you, I was just one of my colleagues in our organization. I don't know if it was Lynn or Cindy, stumbled across your documentary that came out in March of 2024 called Cancer, a Food-Borne Illness. That alone caught our attention. And then when I was able to inhale this 23.5-minute gem in a heartbeat, we knew we would be cyber stalking the heck out of you to have a conversation. And it's taken us months to get you here on the show, and I'm super excited. But I think most importantly is just you are a force to be reckoned with, and I'm very excited for people to learn from you and to see, frankly, what it is you are going to continue to bring into this world. So thank you, Grace, for being here, and welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Naysha. This is like a dream for me because I know all of your work, and so I'm very excited to be here talking with you.
This is what's incredible is you guys, this woman, while she was still in high school, she had, first of all, you'll see it in her documentary, but she would cram her, the education that she had to actually get through to graduate high school, which she just did this summer of 2024 and is just a few weeks shy of starting her college career. But I just thought it was incredible. You would focus in the morning to get your basic required schoolwork done, then spend the afternoons going down many rabbit holes. Please tell us why this topic of food and cancer and the connection between them became so near and dear to you.
Yeah, it really all started the summer before my junior year of high school. My dad gave me a book called Deep Nutrition by Dr. Kate Shanahan. And I was just, I knew kind of the basics of health, but what I mean by that is it's like the basic that most people know today, which is you should eat vegetables, you should probably be active, like move more than you eat. All those kinds of like truths we hear that we're like, okay, that doesn't really help anyone. It just lets us know we're probably not eating right or doing the right thing. And so that's where I was at. But my dad was like, Grace, you have to read this book because I'm a huge science nerd. Back then I was really into astronomy. I love physics. I love all of that kind of stuff. But biology was my first love. And so he was like, she talked a lot about biology and this thing called epigenetics. I was like, what's that? I've never heard of that. I was like, because I had only learned high school biology, which they just focus on DNA, all of that kind of basic stuff. And so then when I read the book, I was just mind blown because I was like, I took AP biology and none of this was mentioned at all when I was going. Well, and Dr. Kate would bring up things like seed oils, which first of all, I was like, what even is this? Most people, when they hear that, they don't even know that it exists. They just think like, I literally just assumed like there's cooking oil and you use it. And that's kind of as far as I had ever even like gone down that rabbit hole. And then epigenetics, she explained, is the fact that our DNA wasn't actually permanent in a sense because there are these chemical markers that can actually alter the expression of the DNA itself, and they're impacted by our environment, whether it's outside of ourselves and even inside of ourselves. So at all kinds of levels. And so that was fascinating to me because I felt as though when I was going through biology, everything was very set in place and it was all very systemic. Like you had the DNA, it then created the exact protein that was needed for the exact task within your cell, and that was it. And it was not really something that was more malleable and that I had impact on. So I was instantly hooked, and I went back to school that year because I go to the unique alternative private school where basically we are encouraged to develop a passion project in the afternoon. And so it's kind of like a senior thesis, except you do it for all 4 years, and it's extremely ambitious. The goal has to be something that not only kids think is impossible, but adults think is impossible. Went back that year and I told my guide who runs this program, and I said, I want to focus on epigenetics. And I read this interesting article on how epigenetics in cancer is kind of a new field of research. So I kind of want to focus on this, and specifically food and epigenetics in cancer. I was like, that's really interesting to me. And she was like, okay, well then your goal is going to be to impact every single kid in your generation and let them know about how food is giving them cancer. And I was like, okay, yeah, casually, I'm just gonna cancer, I guess, So that was my goal. And so I got started right away, and I had time in the afternoon because I was learning on a computer from AI applications. So it's all adaptive apps. And so all of my subjects I was able to crank through just within 3 hours in the morning. And so my entire afternoons were free to pursue this project. So I was basically starting off my journey by spending every single day reading as much as I could. Because if there's one thing I've learned, if you want to learn anything, you just have to start reading. Like, that is ultimately the best way. So I was doing that, and then I was summarizing it because I also felt like it was important to kind of actively recall what it was that I was learning and then add in my own kind of opinion or take. And that's when I started posting on X as well, because in the program, I was encouraged to not only just like research and create in the dark, but actually build in public and get feedback. So even though I hadn't even graduated high school, let alone got my PhD in biochemistry or was going to med school, I was like, okay, I'm going to start sharing with people what I'm learning, because I felt as though I was doing enough work to where I would trust someone like myself if I needed some good information on how specifically sugar is going to regulate, maybe the epigenetic mechanisms that alter your TT2 gene or something like that. And so I wanted to hear that kind of stuff. So I was like, maybe other people want to. So I started posting on X, and I was just summarizing what I was reading and then adding my own take at the end, like actionable insight. Because in these papers, and Naysha, there's so much jargon, and it discourages anyone from actually going, even though we all have the access to read it. So you live in the age of information. And so I was doing that, and eventually I think I went from, we had a 3-week sprint specifically where I had to get from 0 to 1,000 followers. That was my goal. And I ultimately hit it, which was crazy. But in order to do that, I had to reach out to so many experts and doctors and scientists and whistleblowers. And I was just trying to connect, get feedback, and see if they could help me grow and just continue on my journey. So I have a couple of names like Tally Means. He's very popular right now. He is a powerhouse.
Yep.
He was an ex-Coca-Cola consultant, and he has so much wisdom on what goes on behind the scenes of these big food corporations. And it's just blowing people's mind because some of the statistics he has are crazy. So he mentored me very early on because I literally reached out to him on Twitter and was like, hey, I'm a teenager, really passionate about, exposing these big food corporations, whatever. Would you want to get on a Zoom call with me? And he said yes. And so I think a big part of my journey is, as a teen, you have to put yourself out there because adults are so willing to help you if you truly show that you're working hard and you're passionate about something and you just have an open mind and are trying to learn. So that was really a big part of my journey. But I mean, the other half, as you know, Dr. Naysha, is just being beat down every day by all the truths you're hearing in this thing. Like, what I knew before to be health can't even be considered that, because every single preconceived belief I had was proved completely wrong. And that's hard. It's like mentally straining to not only be learning so much, but actually unlearning everything at this time. Incongruency. And so I was just reading article after article. First, how the My Food Plate, whatever that initiative is just a complete joke, and you hear like, oh, okay, carbs actually aren't good. And all of the grains we're eating are processed. And then I knew processed food was bad, but I also didn't know that a lot of foods I considered food still were processed. And so then that was really confusing me. And then I was reading all this stuff about sugar and how it's not just like sugar's going to make you fat, it's that sugar's actually going to be the reason why you develop all of these chronic diseases later on in life that we still are struggling to find cures for. The
Yeah.
similar connection between sugar and Alzheimer's too, I think really shocked me, just like type 3 diabetes, but it's just things like that where your mind is constantly being blown. So that was kind of the beginning of my journey. And I mean, I like to highlight that stuff because of course I had a personal connection to the disease as well. I did lose a loved one to cancer, but I think that it was a mix of that and also just my own curiosity that kind of drove everything together. Like I needed all of those pieces to fall into place for me to end up where I am today. So
My gosh, I'm right now, I'm just sitting here just rolling in the words that are coming out of your mouth and just like having to keep checking myself to realize this young woman started this process when she was 17 years old. She's newly out of high school and yet has made such an impact already in your short time on this planet with you're just getting started. And, you mentioned people like Dr. Kate Shanahan, Callie Means and Dr. Seafried, Dr. Tom Seafried, that's in your documentary as well. These are massive heavy hitter people that have influenced so many. And what I think is really cool is you are also, you've got big enough ovaries that you literally just reach right out to these people. You go back, which I think is extraordinary because a lot of my adult colleagues and myself included would be a little bit remiss to be like, oh gosh, I don't know if I can reach out and talk to these folks, and you just go for it. I think that's just something that's really, really powerful here. My other hope is that people are listening, that you had just this spark of curiosity and that you've used a few words that really stand out to me, accessibility. And that this is just someone who said, this is interesting. I read something that started a fire inside of me and I went down a lot of rabbit holes and here we are. This is accessible to anybody, the information that Grace, stumbled upon herself and started asking the hard questions and even dealt with your own, cognitive dissonance of, oh gosh, I really don't want this to be true, but it is. And I have to unlearn and relearn and think this through and then be up against a mountain of naysayers and even people who are willing to just bash you. I mean, that's the other thing. And so I'm curious, like, well, before we go there, I want to just say, I love your parents. Like,
thank you. Because they love you. And
I'm like, how amazing that I hope that every parent listening to this realizes that, you could bring home a book like this to your kiddo and start them on a whole new path. And, the fact that Epigenetics is also very near and dear to my heart. And one of the first books I started to recommend to people who were curious about epigenetics was the book called Pottinger's Prophecy. It's, gosh, it's been out almost, I think, 15 years now. It's been out for a long time, but it just gives this starting point of understanding the field of epigenetics in general. And then I love that Kate took it further, more specific in the food realm. And as Grace mentioned, it's now, an entire field of study in the field of oncology. But I just like one thing I think that you show here and that your family brought forth is just start somewhere, like get curious and just start to learn because we are no longer being taught these things.
no,
Have to look for it. And so I'm curious, like, first of all, like for your peers, where would you suggest they start in whatever area of interest? Like just separate even from what you're doing, like what would be your first recommendation about where do you get started on a passion project like this?
yeah, I mean, the first thing is defining what your passion is, what the purpose behind it is, and whether it's externally valuable. I think that's a really important one as well because I had a lot of passions before even I found all of the interesting things within epigenetics because, I also love music. So I've played the piano my whole life. I also love art and I really love to write. So I kind of would try a ton of different things, but I never could quite find something that was externally valuable. And I think what's so powerful about that, especially as a teen, is if you finally feel the impact that you're making on other people's lives, that also fuels the passion. Because it's one thing to say you enjoy something, but it's another thing to realize you're good at it and you're making an impact. Because that then itself gets you committed. You're no longer just working on something that is near and dear to your heart. It's no, what you do is genuinely going to change someone's day. So you have to, I think it's taking on that responsibility really was a game changer for me. Because I mean, we are still teenagers. So it's like we want to have fun and we want to go to the movies with your friends. But it made it much easier to make the decisions to stay home and write a really long Twitter thread when I would get a DM from someone that would say like, hey, I'm at Whole Foods right now. I'm really nervous because my mom was recently diagnosed with cancer. What are your favorite brands of chips? And I know that sounds like such a basic thing, but it was just kind of a realization where I was like, people are actually listening to me. I'm not just posting words into the abyss. Because I'm also kind of like, I'll talk a lot. So I'm like, I guess I can do this too. No, those kind of first messages really changed my life. But if I also do like to put this in there, if your kid is interested in doing a super ambitious project within high school, that will be very hard and give them tons of life skills and experiences that will set them up for adulthood. The Alpha X program that I did at my school is actually available online to students. So I can share with you the link after. Maybe we can put that in the podcast description.
Yes.
I mean, it truly changed my life, and I think it can change every student's life because in the program, they basically take you through every step of the way of how you would break down a massive goal like this, how to build an audience, how to connect with experts, that kind of stuff. So yeah, super.
And I'm assuming this could be good for adults as well, because we are wide. I love this. Talk to me a little bit about the pushback. If I'm assuming, I've been in this journey for over 3 decades, I know what kind of pushback there is. I can only imagine what it's like. And how do you, a young woman just getting started in the world, how have you met it? And how do you internalize, how do you protect and take care of yourself in the midst of it?
For sure. That is such a great question, especially in this crazy age of social media where everyone is watching you and judging you every step of the way. I will say, I think, and even though this probably bothers my dad to no end, when someone tells me no or I can't do something, I don't think there's ever been like more of a fire that gets set off inside of me. Like that is my kind of fuel. And so when I was first starting on X and I would get certain comments like, oh, she's a grifter. Oh, this is pseudoscience, blah, blah, blah. Like people would even argue with me about the study. And I'm like, you clearly didn't read it because even the abstract describes what you just said wasn't true. So I would just basically respond to it, be like, here you go. And I would just link the paper. I wouldn't even say anything. I would just link it again because sometimes people need reminded, like I wasn't trying to claim that this was my research. I was just trying to summarize it for people. And so when they would say things like that, I was like, well, I guess that's good because that means that I'm making people angry with what I'm saying. And the truth actually does do that to a lot of people. And that's happened to me before where it's not fun to hear. And I think when you're hearing it from a teenager, then the first thing that you can say is, oh, well, it's definitely fake then. So I don't even need to worry about it. So when they would call me things like grifters or whatever, I'm like, okay, well, this thread got your attention and it is true. So it's, even if it stays in the back of their mind a little bit, like that's very effective, I think. So really using it to realize that like when you're sharing the truth and when you're trying to reach a massive audience, which sometimes you have to be controversial in order to do that. Unfortunately, in the age of information, you do. That's just how you get eyes on things now. Then it just kind of comes with it. And sometimes you get some funny ones. Sometimes it's great for content too. If they're really like going deep in an argument, you're like, oh, I can use this to explain another thing. But yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
I love it. And I resonate so much with your no as like a double dare because I had a similar experience. I mean, when they told me, all those years ago that, you're going to die and there's nothing you can do about it. It's like, wait a minute, let's reframe this. And that has been my superpower of leaning into the nose. And I really love that that's part of who you are, Grace. So powerful. Right. You are comfortable in your own skin and your own approach. Like that level of confidence is also to be celebrated here. Before we go a little bit deeper, because I, of course, have had the privilege of watching your documentary and know all about the backstory to it, but talk to the folks who might be hearing about you for the very first time. Give us the premise of what this whole documentary, this short, concise, but deeply impactful documentary has to share.
Yeah. So my documentary, Cancer, Foodborne Illness, follows me through my journey because I wanted it to feel a little bit more like a story, not just like a ton of facts that are being thrown at you, even though I think they're all important and very interesting. Maybe not the typical viewer does. And so it starts, with me, and I talk about my grandpa and basically how I had this personal relationship to cancer as a disease, and ultimately how everyone believes cancer as a disease is either genetic or is caused by random somatic mutations to their DNA. So basically, most people believe they have zero control over the disease. And that's just something that a lot of people don't even know they kind of hold as a truth in their mind. It's just in the back of their head somewhere. And that's kind of how they keep going through life without any changes. Because they're like, well, it's out of my control, And so it really had to first understand whether that was true or not. Because I wanted to control my risk of developing this disease. I wanted to be the one who could say, I tried everything and unfortunately it still happened and I'm still going to continue trying because I don't want to just wait and have something hit me like, oh, unlucky roll of the dice, you got stage 4 colon cancer. I'm like, well, that makes zero sense to me because it doesn't just happen like that. You don't just get stage 4. It has to go through all the different stages to get there. And people don't think about that kind of stuff though. So I really started by just trying to see if there were any other causes of cancer itself, like what the hallmarks of cancer are and what the origin could be, and if it truly is random genetic change. And that's when I fell upon Dr. Naysayers' work, Dr. Thomas Seyfried's work, Dr. Jason Fung's work. There's tons of incredible books right now on cancer's metabolic origin, which I was always a fan of mitochondria when I was learning biology. So I was very excited to hear mitochondria has some relevance, and mitochondria is actually really connected to epigenetics too. So that was like, oh, super easy. I'll throw that into my wheelhouse. But metabolic health, I was like, what even is that? Because everyone thinks of metabolism as like, oh, I have a slow or I have a fast metabolism, so that's how I stay skinny. Like that's literally what teens think of it as, and there's no other meaning of the word. And so I was reading these books and my mind was just blown because the fact that when your mitochondria are dysfunctional and broken aligns with all of the hallmarks of cancer was just insane to me. The fact that it did align, and I would try to be very critical because I didn't want to just at first believe everything I read right away. So then I would go and I'd read some other articles on cancer's genetic origin. And I just compare the evidence between the two. And this could just be the way that I researched it. But I found that the evidence for cancer's metabolic origin was 10 times more compelling every single time. Because it just made more sense using just common knowledge.
Right.
And then also when you actually looked at the hardcore data. And I kept reading these other studies too, like the nuclear transfer experiment.
Massive.
Okay, well, it's clear that even when you have the genetic mutations for cancer, whether that's, the BRCA gene or whatever for a specific type of cancer, it's not guaranteed you're going to develop the disease. And that really was kind of the tipping point for me to where I realized, okay, I've been thinking of everything where it's not genetics, it's not DNA, which is what all of the people in the pharmaceutical industry, all of the people who are actually in the field of oncology want you to believe as well. Because we have things like the Human Genome Project that have just been funded for so long, and there's billions of dollars behind it, where they believe that, ever since we discovered, the double helix of the DNA, this is the answer. We mapped out the human genome, this is the answer. And it's just not. So we've actually kind of been stuck in the same age of biology for a long time, or we haven't made much breakthroughs, specifically when we're looking for cures for these diseases, because we're not even looking at the right thing. We're looking at a byproduct of the actual issue. And the actual issue is this mitochondrial dysfunction because of our diet. And it just was making me so excited when I started to see a common thread. Because at the same time, I was reading about all the nutrition stuff that was happening. And I was reading about how seed oils have become the number one things in our diets. Grains, corn, the top products that are the most subsidized in the US, agriculture business. And I was like, it all aligns when you see then what also is a huge offender to our mitochondria is now the number one thing in our diet. And now we're more sick than ever. And you just pile it all on. And I think once people get to that phase, it just clicks. You're like, okay,
Right.
this makes sense. This is powerful. And this needs to be our focus now. But as you know, there's no money behind it. And unfortunately, some of that is due to corruption. And that was one of the first places that I wanted to really highlight in my documentary, because I think everyone should be just downright mad, like so angry before they even try to do any change, because they've been sold out. I mean, this is their health, and it's been in the hands of people who are more concerned with their paycheck than they are the person actually getting to thrive and live well. And you hear these sayings, like a sick patient is the only thing that makes money, not a healthy one, not a dead one. So we're living life in a not optimal state, and we're kind of just miserable, And so I mean, that's kind of a really long summary, but
We're right.
the main takeaway that I want people to have with my documentary, that health is in your control. The food entire system of America is totally getting you sick. Yeah, quote unquote food. And then the pharmaceutical industry is not the answer. It's you actually taking control of your health and changing your lifestyle factors, because these pills just will not save you. So, yeah.
Wow. What I think, Grace, is really remarkable is you also broadened your aperture of the viewpoint on all of this, that it's one thing to look at just food, but it's about the system around the food and the political and the agricultural and the educational and the pharmaceutical. Like, you have unfortunately or fortunately taken the lid off the Pandora's box and recognized, wow, this is still much more than, a problem with a seed oil or too much sugar. It's an industry driven. So in fact, what do you think was for you? You kind of alluded to a few, but what do you think has been your biggest aha from this project? What do you think maybe the top 1, 2, or 3 misconceptions do you think you now see very differently than when you first started out with this project?
Yeah. I think that, I do have to highlight, because I realized, mitochondrial health is so important, and metabolic health particularly, realizing how carbohydrates, that doesn't just encompass your typical things that you assume are sugar, like desserts and stuff like that.
Right.
That sweets are in basically everything that we make as the basis for our diet. And you have to actually understand that that is still going to affect your blood glucose levels. So that one is a little bit more specific, but I think realizing, carbs are everywhere, and carbs are something we're not paying any attention to, and we probably should, because they make up the majority of our diet right now. That was one. Another one was when I found I think it was a PubMed study, and it said that 90 to 95% of cancers are caused by our environmental or lifestyle factors. And I was like, how does this exist? And people still think it's genetics, which is 5%. That's 10%. Really appalled me then, that I was like, is this a fake article? I was trying to fake Walter's like, how do people not look at this and say, whoa, I need to change everything. This is convincing. And it's, that was a really crazy one for me. And I think the last one was national health organizations, which I didn't really touch until the end. of my
Yeah.
journey because I kind of just assumed they were good as well. Because all your life, you hear all these things like, oh, well, we donated to the National Cancer Society. We made an American Heart Association donation, and they're going to help these kids. And they really get you with all of their kind of pathos advertisement. And everyone has sympathy for people who are sick, of course, because you don't want to be sick. But these corporations are just so corrupt. Specifically, American Cancer Society, when I learned that they had accepted a $1.8 million fund from Coca-Cola, my mind was blown because Coca-Cola is such an obvious cancer offender.
Right.
It is just loaded with sugar, and everyone knows that. You don't have to be a nutritionist to know that's bad for you. Literally, like 5-year-olds know that. My niece knows that. And they still accepted a fund.
Right.
And even though some people would argue with me and say, well, that's good because it's still going to a good cause. Just to make you question whether they are really acknowledging that that is a truth of the disease of cancer, that sugar is going to feed cancer, which they're not. Otherwise, you wouldn't be accepting that fund.
Fun.
It's kind of those things that really do blow your mind, but they're important to think about because they are something that we are impacted by in our everyday lives. And they also will change your approach to a lot of things surrounding health.
Amazing. I'm curious, and I'm sure this question will come up from our listeners. It's like, walk me through, like, how did what you learned change the way you eat or consider the source of your food? How like a day in the life of Grace's dietary intake?
Yeah. No, I love getting to talk about this. So when I started, I wasn't eating terribly unhealthy. My mom is Mexican, so she loves to cook. She's kind of cooked for my sister and I, like, our whole lives. So we've always known real food. But then also because, my parents didn't really know yet, we would still consume a lot of processed foods on the side. Even foods that are said to be organic and stuff like that. But it's still just processed bad stuff. And so I was eating that and I was doing good health-wise, but I had kind of unsteady energy levels. Like I would have the 3 p.m. energy slump at school where I was just so done. And you come over to school, my parents would be like, how's your day? And I'm like, guys, I want to tell you, but I literally cannot. I can't. I just need to go and sit down somewhere for a little bit and just like eat some food or something. And I didn't really know why that was. I also wasn't really getting great sleep. And sometimes I would have a little bit of trouble focusing for prolonged periods of time. And I think a lot of teenagers experience this. Most kids are just told they have ADHD, ADD, that kind of stuff, without maybe that even being true. And so that was kind of how I was living my life. But then as I was reading this stuff, it became really hard not changing what I was doing.
Right.
And I don't really know if you can learn this stuff and not change either. Because I was thinking about that and I was like, could I truly continue to consume these high carb, high added sugar foods without thinking about what it's doing to my cells? So I think I just care too much about the health of my cells at this point. And so I started to first cut out all ultra processed foods and all fast food, which is really bad. And
it's for a teenager, that's almost like the food group for ration, right? But
it's the main food group. And maybe people don't realize too, but teens, what they consider food, it's not even just when you hear processed food, you think of things like chips, No, it's like pockets, it's pizza bagels, it's goldfish, things where you literally cannot identify what ingredients would be in it. It could be anything. And so that's like the norm. And it's very difficult to get kids to go from that to a kale salad. So I'm trying to bridge the gap with that right now on some things. But yeah, I started to eat more of a ketogenic diet after I was cutting out those fast foods and ultra processed foods. And I just was lowering my carb count day to day. And now I'm pretty much in nutritional ketosis most of the time.
Right.
But I do need to get better still about tracking. That's the one thing I find hardest because with certain things, like I think it's just good to know what spikes glucose
Really?
for everyone, and I haven't done enough like self experiments with that yet where I can just see what my specific differences are in blood glucose, because there are some obvious ones where you're like, okay, that's probably going to spike it. But
Yeah.
then, like if you were to try a specific kind of nut versus another one or something like that,
Super nuanced.
but no nuanced. But yeah, it's totally changed my productivity. It's changed my sleep. It's changed. I don't have that slump in the afternoon anymore. I
Thank-
feel really good. And that kind of showed me that I had been living on bad energy for a long time.
Wow.
And that's kind of a big selling point for teens too, because they don't realize when you're living kind of almost sick for a long time, you don't realize that until you feel good for once. But getting teens to be motivated enough to stick with something to feel good is the tough part. But once they do, it's actually pretty addicting because you can feel the difference if you truly have been on that ultra processed diet for a long time.
That's huge. So I really appreciate that you kind of became a living laboratory, and that you also really highlight the idea that like this isn't a blame game. You don't know what you don't know until you know. And what I think is really extraordinary, Grace, is once you did know, it became like the cognitive dissonance was there too. Like I can't go back to what has been so normalized in my culture, in my peer group, in my world. And so do you how do you get along with your peers with this knowledge? Just curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because it's definitely not accepted amongst teens. I mean, you are the weird one. If you're bringing your lunch to school, you're the weird one. You're at a restaurant. And when everyone is ordering, their specific burgers and stuff like that, you are taking the meat out and you are also adding like a side of avocado and you're asking for a side of olive oil for your spoon. It is seen as different. And I also don't think that's necessarily teens' fault, though, because that's just the food industry's fault as well. They had more options that were normal, and I didn't have to kind of configure a meal in front of myself, then it would look more normal to my friends too. But I think it's really just trying to figure out how to get through to them and how to say, like, look, I get that you don't care. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't care about things like cancer. They don't care about heart disease.
Right. Yeah. Wisdom is what they say. Wisdom is on youth.
Not live forever. And most of the times I've only met teens who are aware of it when they have actually had real life experience with it. That's what kind of opens your mind to those things. But otherwise, it's a distant reality for them. And so I try to bring it back to things that they care about right now, which because social media is so huge and we live in a very visually focused world, things like talking about acne, talking about hair, talking about feeling your quality, mental health, talking about equating things to smoking cigarettes, to vaping. These are things that teens recognize as bad and you do not want to partake in. But whenever, they eat McDonald's, they're like, this is normal. This is good stuff. But when you tell them that the French fries they're having is basically the equivalent toxin amount as 25 cigarettes, then they're like, wait,
what? Yeah.
Well, and I literally tested this. I filmed it. It didn't end up making the final cut in the documentary, but I went to college campuses and I just would literally go and I would tell people outside at Dietary, Chick-fil-A, McDonald's, I had a pack of cigarettes. I was walking around and I would say, hey, do you know that this is what you're consuming? And they were like, I'm sorry, what? And then I would have a conversation with them and they'd be like, well, I get it every once in a while. And I was like, well, the issue with that is if you smoke every once in a while, like, what do you think's happening to you? And then it's actually worse with these fries because do you know what happens to fats in your cells? And some of these people, they were like, I think there was this one like young med school student. He was like, well, yeah, I know, it goes in the phospholipid bilayer and all this stuff. You're right. So what's the half-life on these things? And they were like, oh, and I was like, yeah, you're getting that rancid stuff stored there. And it's just totally inflaming your cells. So those things stick with them for sure. And I'm really just trying to work on how we can change the messaging a bit to get through to that. Because like I said, once we get them to listen, make a change, and feel good for once, then it's so much easier to bring in the kale salads, bring in, the zero antibiotics, grass finished, free range chicken. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, I'm really on this health kick. And that's what I've seen even with adults, once you get that health bug, you can't really stop. And then you start looking at the ingredients in house cleaners. You start looking at all these kinds of things. It expands from food. But starting with food is kind of my goal when it comes to teens.
I love it. And it's, one thing, it's like as a clinician and a researcher and an advocate for, optimal health in the world. One thing that's very interesting is, when I share the message, when I explain the why,
Yeah.
I get often accused of being like fear mongering or whatnot. And, so I'm always trying to explain, no, I'm sharing data. Don't shoot the messenger. I know it's a difficult message to hear. But one thing I think is really interesting for young people to hear today, and I'm sure you've run across this in your research, is that cancer historically was considered a disease of the aged, of people of a certain age. It is now the fastest growing rates of cancer under the age of 40.
Yeah.
And the fastest rates of colorectal cancer are under the age of 35. And yet no one's talking about this. No one's sounding the alarm that I think the last study I looked at, we have a 46% increase in cancer rates under the age of 40. And this is getting worse. It's like, it's like a explosion and no one's asking the right questions. And so what you're highlighting and even what research this summer was suggesting, they still keep trying to look at this as a genetic code.
My gosh, it's crazy. When I read that article that came out on, 80% of people getting cancer now is early onset, and they're like, we think it might be food. B specific gene, and I'm like, you were so close.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just it. You're like, nope, just kidding. And this is where I think people listening to you right now, we're going to have a link to the documentary. One of the things we talked about before you came on is we really want your involvement in Metabolic Health Day, which is October 10th every year, to get this information out there. We want to see your documentary played in every single school, from grade school through high school and college and beyond. We'd love to see every one of our clinicians have a viewing of your documentary. So I'm actually putting a call to action to my community, the Metabolic Tree Institute of Health community, metabolic terrain experts and patient advocates to take this to the streets, bring this into their own communities and share this, because it is so extraordinary that it's one thing coming from a crazy naturopath who's been at this for over 3 decades, or saying that these things, but it's even more extraordinary when it comes from, kind of a layperson, high school kid who is literally making one of the biggest ripples in this discussion in the fabrics of the ethos around us. So I love that. And so what I want to kind of have you take home is, on your LinkedIn page, it literally says science-based investigative journalist, filmmaker, and citizen science on a mission to flatten the curve for cancer cases for Gen Z by 2040. And I wanted to highlight this because World Health Organization shows that our cancer rates are expected to double globally by 2030. So you are on a mission, and I have no doubt in my mind that you are making a ripple and will make a ripple here. But I just want people to know this. So what is next for you? In 2 weeks, you start college, but what's next for you?
Yeah. I mean, right now I'm focused on first building kind of an empire of activists when it comes to these big food organizations, because ultimately I believe in order to change what they're making and kind of the standards of our food in the industry, we're going to have to change what consumers are buying. So because teens are such a big part of their market, I think that if we can get teens to start using their phones, which we love to do, to actually start speaking about all of this food stuff, just like how they will with other kind of issues of the day. I think a lot of teens feel empowered to post on social media about things like climate change, all that kind of stuff. But then when it comes to, talking about our soil, it gets a little murky. So the app is going to be called Active Eats as of right now. And ultimately, it's going to be an AI-based app where you can take a photo of the food in front of you. It's going to analyze it, and it'll give you a cigarette cancer score. So I ultimately found that when you show kids that, it kind of gets in their brain as, oh, this causes cancer. This is not good. And this is how many years it could potentially take off of my life.
Wow.
There's a lot of different studies to do that so that you can get an estimate. And ultimately, the goal is just to get teens to think about it before they put it in their mouth. And they'll also have access to then a full list of nutrients if some of them are interested in that, where they can see, oh, this additive is banned in the UK, and be like, why is it banned there but not banned here? You're like, well, that just doesn't make sense. And the goal is to get that posted on their stories. And I really want them to post about their school lunches, because you've had nearly enough content about school lunches and kids have to live through it every single day. So I want kids to take photos of that and then get their cigarette score, send it to their nutritional board and be like, hey, what's the deal with this?
Yeah.
Information where the nutritional board's going to be like, oh, okay, maybe we should change X, Y, and Z. And I think starting at the local level and then expanding is how we can create a really powerful movement. So I'm focused first on getting these cafeterias and the classrooms, the vending machines, all of those areas cleaned up first, and then ultimately expanding to more. And that's kind of my big focus right now. I also am about to start my podcast, which I'm very excited about. I loved making my documentary so much. I just wanted to continue to do video content. So the first couple of episodes of my podcast should be coming out soon, and it's going to be really fun. The whole goal is just to keep exposing all of these lies we've been told, whether it's in nutrition, whether it's about, our health. That is the main focus, and that is going to be called The Dish, which I'm excited.
Amazing. That is so clever. That is so clever, Grace. And I love it. The ripple continues, basically, is what I'm hearing you say. And I hope it goes without saying that MTIH is absolutely 100% your biggest cheerleader, and wanting to help in any way we can to move this movement forward, because your movement helps our movement. The only cure for cancer really is prevention.
Yep.
And it's definitely your passion project. And honestly, girl, after meeting you, after watching what you've created and being in your energy field, if anyone can make a change, I believe it is you. So it is an absolute delight to have you here sharing your story. I hope people's jaws are dropped to the ground, just realizing again and again that this is a young woman who is just getting started, and the sky is the limit. So Grace, thank you for everything you bring to the world.
Thank you so much. This was so lovely, Dr. Naysha.